Do you enjoy chilling stories, mysterious legends, and tales that make you think twice before turning off the lights? Then you're in the right place. On this channel, every video is a journey into the unknown, bringing you spooky tales, curiosities, and mysteries you won't find just anywhere. So hit that subscribe button, drop a like, and share this video with someone who also loves a good dark story. That way you'll help our community grow and make sure you don't miss the next tale.
It was a morning like many others in the small village of Millbrook, nestled between the rolling green hills of the countryside. The sun rose lazily from behind the ridges, painting the sky in orange hues that blended with the scattered clouds. The air still carried the coolness of dawn, and the dew sparkled like tiny diamonds on the wild grass that grew around the modest cottages. In this bucolic setting lived Thomas, a boy of only 12 years with unruly brown hair and honey-colored eyes that reflected infinite curiosity about the world. His clothes, carefully mended by his mother's skilled hands, told the story of a family that knew well the meaning of hardship. Thomas's father, a simple and hard-working man, spent his days breaking stones on the road that connected the village to the nearest town, back-breaking work that earned just enough to keep the family fed. The house where they lived was small, built with clay bricks and covered by red tiles worn by time. A single room served as kitchen, living room, and bedroom for the entire family. The dirt floor was swept daily by Thomas's mother, Martha, a woman with a sweet smile and hands calloused by constant work. She supplemented the family income by washing clothes for the wealthier families in the region, scrubbing fabrics at the makeshift wash tub behind the house until her hands became red and sore. Thomas spent his days helping with household chores and dreaming of distant adventures. He had heard stories about the great cattle drives that passed through the main road, taking livestock and horses to faraway lands. These stories, told by the elders in the village's central square, filled his imagination with images of brave men mounted on magnificent horses, crossing vast landscapes under starry skies. On that particular morning, Thomas was helping his mother hang clothes on the improvised line when a distant sound caught his attention. It was a rhythmic noise, like drums beating in cadence, but he soon recognized it as the sound of horse hooves striking the packed earth of the road. The boy let the sheet he was holding fall to the ground and ran toward the low fence that separated their yard from the main road. What he saw left him completely fascinated. A massive cattle drive was approaching, raising a cloud of golden dust that shimmered under the morning sun's rays. There were dozens and dozens of horses, some mounted by experienced cowboys, others being led loose, forming an impressive herd that moved like a single living entity. The men commanding that drive had faces burned by the sun and experienced gazes, wearing worn leather hats and tall boots that reached their knees. At the front of the drive rode an imposing man with graying mustache and dignified bearing. His horse, a magnificent bay animal, moved with elegance and confidence. This was Don Sebastian, known throughout the region as one of the greatest horse breeders in the state. His ranch was many leagues away, and he was leading his herd to sell them in the markets of the big cities, a journey that would take several weeks. Thomas was mesmerized watching that majestic procession. Each horse seemed to tell a different story through its coat, its bearing, its movements. There were animals with brilliant chestnut coats, others black as the darkest night, some spotted with unique patterns that looked like abstract paintings. Their muscles rippled under their skin with each step, and their manes fluttered in the wind like silk banners. Then something unexpected happened. One of the horses in the drive, a young chestnut colt with white markings on its chest and legs, stumbled on a loose stone in the road and fell heavily. The animal got up quickly, but was clearly limping on its right front leg. Don Sebastian made a gesture with his hand, and the entire drive stopped instantly. The rancher dismounted his horse with the agility of someone who had spent his entire life riding, and approached the injured animal. His experienced eyes examined the hurt leg carefully, gently palpating the site of the injury.
After a few minutes of silent examination, he shook his head with regret. The colt could not continue the journey. The long walk would only worsen his condition. Don Sebastian looked around, seeking a solution to his dilemma. That's when his eyes met those of Thomas, who continued watching everything from over the low fence. The boy was so absorbed in the scene that he didn't notice he had become the center of the rancher's attention. "Boy," called Don Sebastian, his deep voice echoing through the silent morning, "come here." Thomas felt his heart race. He looked back at the house, hoping his mother would call him back, but Martha was also watching the scene with curiosity. With hesitant steps, the boy approached the fence and crossed it, standing just a few meters from the imposing rancher. "What's your name, lad?" asked Don Sebastian, his eyes studying the boy attentively. "Thomas, sir," replied the boy, his voice almost a whisper. "And you live here with your family?" "Yes, sir, in that house there with my mother and father." Don Sebastian nodded slowly, his eyes moving from the simple house back to the boy. He could see poverty stamped in every detail, in the patched clothes, in the small and simple house, in the yard that looked more like vacant land. But he could also see something more in Thomas's eyes, a genuine fascination with horses, a glimmer of admiration that couldn't be faked. "This horse here is hurt," explained the rancher, pointing to the injured animal. "He can't continue the journey with us. He needs care and rest for a few weeks until his leg heals completely." Thomas looked at the colt and felt a pang in his heart. The animal was beautiful, with its chestnut coat shining under the sun and its large, expressive eyes. Even limping, there was a dignity in its bearing that impressed the boy. "Would you like to take care of him?" asked Don Sebastian, completely surprising Thomas. The boy opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked at the colt, then at the rancher, back to the animal. His heart was beating so hard he was sure everyone could hear it. "I don't know how to take care of horses, sir," he finally managed to say. Don Sebastian smiled, the first genuinely warm expression he had shown since arriving. "Horses aren't much different from people, lad. They need food, water, shelter, and affection. And from what I can see, you have plenty of affection to give." The rancher turned and signaled to one of his men, who approached carrying a leather bag. From inside it, Don Sebastian took out some coins and a small sack of grain. "This should be enough to feed the colt for a few weeks. When he's healed and can walk normally, you can sell him at the town market. An animal like this is worth a good sum, enough to help your family for quite some time." Thomas could hardly believe what he was hearing. His legs trembled, and he had to make a conscious effort not to faint right there. A horse, a real horse, his own horse. "But, sir," said the boy, his voice still uncertain, "what if I don't know how to take care of him properly? What if he dies because of me?"
Don Sebastian placed a heavy hand on Thomas's shoulder. "Lad, I've seen many men with horses, and few have in their eyes what I see in yours. You'll take good care of him, I'm sure of that." And so, after some quick guidance on basic horse care, Don Sebastian and his drive departed, leaving behind only the echo of hooves beating on the road and a cloud of dust that slowly dissipated in the morning air. Thomas was left alone with the colt, still trying to process what had just happened. The animal looked at him with its large brown eyes, as if also trying to understand the situation. Thomas slowly extended his hand, and the colt sniffed his fingers before allowing the boy to touch its neck. The skin was soft and warm, and the boy could feel the powerful muscles moving under his fingers. "Well," said Thomas in a low voice, more to himself than to the animal, "I guess you'll be called Thunder." In the days that followed, Thomas's life changed completely. He woke before dawn to care for Thunder, preparing his food and checking the condition of his injured leg. The colt proved docile and intelligent, responding quickly to the boy's loving care. The wound was healing well, and day by day the limping visibly decreased. Thomas built a small shelter in the back of the house, using old wood and palm leaves he found in the area. It wasn't much, but it protected the animal from the strong midday sun and the occasional rains that fell on the region. The boy also improvised a feeding trough using an old zinc bathtub that his mother no longer used. The village people soon learned of the story, and many came to see the colt and congratulate Thomas on his luck. "What a lucky boy," said the women at the market, "getting a horse like that, out of nowhere." The older men nodded approvingly and told stories of their own encounters with horses over the years. But not everyone saw the situation as positive. Old Theodore, a grumpy neighbor known for always finding the negative side of any situation, made sure to express his doubts whenever he met Thomas's family. "Mark my words," he said, wagging his index finger in the air, "no good will come of this. A horse is an expensive animal to maintain, and when the food runs out, what will you do? And if the beast gets sick, veterinarians cost money." Martha, for her part, oscillated between joy at seeing her son so happy and worry about the costs of maintaining a horse. She saw how Thomas had been transformed. His eyes shone in a way she hadn't seen in a long time, and he'd talked constantly about Thunder, about his progress, about his plans when the animal was completely healed. Thomas's father, William, was more pragmatic. He saw the colt as a real opportunity to improve the family's life. A well-cared-for horse could be sold for an amount that would represent several months of his salary breaking stones. He began making plans about how to use the money from the sale. Perhaps fix the house's roof, which leaked in several places during heavy rains, or buy some chickens to start a small farm. 3 weeks passed, and Thunder was practically healed. His leg no longer showed signs of pain, and he moved with the natural grace of his species. Thomas had become an expert in equine care, learning through careful observation and intuition. He knew when the animal was thirsty by the way he moved his ears, when he was happy by the way he swished his tail, and when he wanted attention by how he nuzzled his shoulder. It was on a Thursday afternoon, when the sun was beginning to tilt westward, that Thomas discovered the improvised fence he had built for Thunder was broken. The colt had disappeared. Thomas felt as if the world had collapsed on his shoulders. He ran around the property, shouting the animal's name, checking every corner, every possible hiding place. Nothing. Thunder had vanished without a trace. "Thunder! Thunder!" shouted Thomas, his voice echoing through the hills around the village. Tears streamed down his face as he traveled the nearby trails, hoping to find some sign of the animal. Martha came out of the house upon hearing her son's desperate cries and quickly understood the situation. Her heart broke seeing Thomas's despair. She hugged him tightly, trying to console him as he sobbed against her chest. "He must have gone back to look for the herd," she said softly. "Horses are like that. They miss the pack." William came home from work to find the family in a state of commotion. When he learned what had happened, he placed his hand on his son's shoulder and said the words no father likes to say. "Son, perhaps it's better this way. We didn't have the means to keep the animal indefinitely." But Thomas didn't want to hear about practical aspects. For him, Thunder wasn't just a horse. He was his friend, his responsibility, his dream come true, and now that dream had disappeared, leaving a void that seemed impossible to fill. The neighbors, when they learned the news, reacted in different ways. Some offered help to search for the lost animal. Others, led by old Theodore, shook their heads with an "I told you so" air. It was obvious this would happen. A wild horse never gets used to captivity. The boy was lucky not to have been bitten or trampled. But Mrs. Grace, an elderly lady who lived in the house next door, had a different opinion. "Sometimes," she said, adjusting her shawl over her shoulders, "what seems bad luck at the moment can be the greatest fortune of our lives. Life has its mysteries." For 3 days, Thomas barely ate or slept. He spent hours walking the trails around the village, always hoping to spot the familiar silhouette of Thunder on the horizon. His mother tried to cheer him up by preparing his favorite foods, but the boy only picked at the food without interest. It was on the morning of the 4th day
that Thomas was awakened by a sound that made his heart leap in his chest. It was horse hooves, many horse hooves, beating on the road toward his house. He jumped out of bed and ran to the window, hardly daring to believe what his ears were telling him. What he saw left him completely speechless. Thunder was there, trotting proudly at the front of a small herd of wild horses. There were at least 12 animals following the colt, mares, adult horses, and even some younger colts. It was as if Thunder had become the leader of an entire herd. Thomas ran out of the house, his parents right behind him. The family stood in the yard, watching in amazement as Thunder led the herd directly to the space behind their house, as if presenting his new family to the boy who had cared for him. "Good Lord," murmured Martha, covering her mouth with her hands. "How many horses?" William was doing mental calculations. 12 horses. Even if he could sell only half of them, it would be enough money to completely change the family's life. They could buy a bigger house, maybe even a small piece of land to cultivate. Thunder approached Thomas and nuzzled his chest, as if apologizing for his absence and at the same time boasting of his achievements. The boy hugged the animal's neck, feeling a mixture of relief, joy, and admiration. "Where did you go to get all these horses?" asked Thomas, knowing he wouldn't get an answer, but needing to express his disbelief.
The other horses in the herd maintained a respectful distance, clearly recognizing Thunder as their leader, but also showing curiosity about those humans who seemed so important to their new chief. The news spread through the village like wildfire in dry grass. Within hours, practically all the residents of Millbrook had come to see the miracle of the horses. Some arrived in small groups, whispering among themselves. Others came alone, moved only by curiosity. "Never seen anything like it," said Rose, the village midwife. "A colt leaving and coming back with an entire herd? This is God's work." Old Theodore also appeared, but this time he was visibly uncomfortable with his previous pessimistic predictions. He observed the horses in silence for a few minutes before approaching William. "Well," he said, clearing his throat nervously, "seems like the boy had good luck after all." William smiled, but said nothing. He was too busy observing the horses and trying to estimate their market value. In the following days, Thomas dedicated himself entirely to caring for the new herd. It was much more complex work than caring for just one horse, but he was determined not to disappoint the trust that Thunder had placed in him by bringing the other animals. The boy built larger and more resistant fences, improvised new shelters, and established a routine of feeding and care that kept all the animals healthy and happy. His parents helped as they could, but it soon became clear that Thomas had developed a natural talent for dealing with horses. It was during this intense period of caring for the herd that the accident happened. Thomas was trying to train one of the younger horses, an animal with a fiery temperament and independent spirit. The colt, with a brilliant black coat and wild eyes, wasn't accustomed to human presence and reacted badly to the boy's attempts at approach. In a moment of distraction, while Thomas adjusted the rope he used as improvised reins, the colt reared violently and struck the air with its front hooves. One of them hit Thomas in the right leg with enough force to knock the boy to the ground. The crack of the breaking bone was audible even to Martha, who was in the kitchen preparing lunch. She ran to the yard and found her son on the ground, moaning in pain and holding his right leg. "Thomas, my son!" she screamed, kneeling beside the boy. The leg was visibly deformed, bent at an unnatural angle. William, who had heard his wife's screams, came running from work. One look for him was enough to understand the gravity of the situation. Without wasting time, he lifted his son in his arms and ran with him to Mr. Samuel's cart, the only village resident who owned transportation. The journey to the nearest town, where there was a doctor, took 2 hours that seemed eternal. Thomas drifted in and out of consciousness due to the intense pain, and Martha prayed incessantly during the entire trip. Dr. Henry, an elderly man with white hair and experienced hands, examined Thomas's leg and shook his head seriously. The fracture was severe. The tibia bone had broken in 2 places, and surgery would be necessary to put everything back in its proper place. "The boy will be fine," assured the doctor to the worried parents, "but it will take several months for the leg to heal completely. And even after, he may have a slight limp for the rest of his life." The surgery was performed the same day, and Thomas spent 3 days hospitalized in the small-town clinic. When he finally returned home, his leg was immobilized by a heavy cast that went from his foot to almost his hip, and he would need to use crutches for at least 3 months. The reality of his new condition hit Thomas like a punch to the stomach. He could no longer care for the horses as before, couldn't run or play, couldn't do practically anything that required movement. Worse still, the accident had happened through his own fault. He had been reckless in trying to train a wild animal without the necessary experience. "It was all my fault," he said repeatedly, sinking into deep depression. "If I hadn't been so stupid, none of this would have happened." His parents tried to console him, but the words seemed empty in the face of the boy's frustration and sadness. Thunder and the other horses continued in the yard, but now Thomas could only observe them from afar, sitting on the house's porch with his cast leg extended on a chair. Once again, old Theodore didn't miss the opportunity to express his pessimistic opinions. "I knew those horses would only bring trouble," he said to whoever would listen. "Now the boy is crippled, and the family will have medical expenses they can't afford." And indeed, the medical expenses were accumulating. The surgery, medications, follow-up appointments, everything cost money the family simply didn't have. William had to go into debt with several neighbors to pay the expenses, and the family's financial situation, which was already precarious, became desperate. It was then that news arrived about the war. The country had entered into conflict with a neighboring nation, and the government was recruiting young men to serve in the army. All young men between 16 and 25 years old would be drafted to report to the state capital's barracks, from where they would be sent to the battlefront. James, Thomas's older brother, who worked on a colonel's farm nearby, received his draft notice on a rainy Tuesday. He was only 18 years old, but he was strong and healthy, exactly the type of young man the Army needed. The news left the entire family in panic. James was the second biggest provider for the household, and his absence would mean even more financial difficulties. But worse than that was the fear that he might not return alive from the war.
Thomas watched his brother leave with a mixture of sadness and guilt. Sadness for seeing James go away, perhaps forever. Guilt for being there, safe at home, while his brother marched toward an uncertain destiny. But as the days passed and news from the war reached the village, Thomas began to understand that his bad luck might have been, in fact, the greatest luck of his life. Reports spoke of bloody battles, of young soldiers dead in muddy trenches, of entire families devastated by the loss of their sons. Mrs. Grace, the elderly lady who lived next door, came to visit them on a particularly melancholy afternoon. She sat beside Thomas on the porch, and they both watched Thunder and the other horses grazing peacefully in the yard. "You know, boy," she finally said, her voice soft as the whisper of wind, "sometimes life gives us gifts wrapped in sorrow's paper. Only later, when time passes, can we see the gift that was hidden underneath." Thomas looked at the lady, not completely understanding her words, but feeling there was deep wisdom in them. "Old Theodore always says I had bad luck," said the boy. "First I got the horses, then I broke my leg. He says the horses brought misfortune." Mrs. Grace smiled, her wrinkled hands folding in her lap. "And what do you think, Thomas?" The boy thought for a long moment. "I don't know anymore," he finally admitted. Sometimes I think it was good luck. Sometimes I think it was bad luck. Maybe it was both at the same time." "Maybe," agreed the lady. "Life isn't made of good luck or bad luck, but just of life. Things that happen, and that only make sense when we look back and see the complete picture." Those words echoed in Thomas's mind for days. He began thinking about the entire sequence of events that had started that morning when Don Sebastian and his drive passed through the road. Each event had led to the next, like dominoes falling in sequence. If Don Sebastian hadn't passed through there on that specific day, Thomas would never have gotten Thunder. If Thunder hadn't run away and returned with the herd, Thomas would never have had so many horses to care for. If he hadn't tried to train the wild colt, he would never have broken his leg. And if he hadn't broken his leg, he would have been drafted for the war like his brother. It was impossible to say which part of this sequence represented good luck and which represented bad luck. Perhaps, as Mrs. Grace had suggested, this distinction wasn't really important. As the months passed and his legs slowly healed, Thomas developed a new perspective on his situation. He learned to care for the horses even with his physical limitations, developing techniques and strategies he hadn't considered before. He discovered he didn't need to be able to run and jump to be a good horse handler. Patience, observation, and gentleness were much more important than physical agility. Thunder, as if understanding his young caretaker's condition, became even more docile and cooperative. The animal seemed to have developed a special intuition about Thomas's limitations, always approaching slowly and positioning himself so the boy could reach him easily, even while leaning on crutches. The other horses in the herd also seemed to have perceived the change. They became calmer and more obedient, as if Thunder had communicated to all that their young caretaker needed special consideration. It was a phenomenon that impressed even the most skeptical visitors to the village. During this recovery period, Thomas received an unexpected visit. Don Sebastian returned to the village, this time in an elegant carriage pulled by two magnificent white horses. The rancher had learned through acquaintances about the boy's accident and about the impressive herd that Thunder had brought. "I came to see how the young horse breeder is doing," said Don Sebastian, descending from the carriage with a smile on his face. His eyes surveyed the yard where the 12 horses grazed peacefully, and he nodded approvingly. "From what I can see, you've become an expert on the subject." Thomas, sitting on the porch with his legs still in a cast, felt embarrassed about his condition. "Sorry, sir. I broke my leg trying to train one of the horses. It was my fault." "Fault?" Don Sebastian laughed, a deep and warm sound. "Lad, every man who works with horses has taken a kick or two. It's part of learning. The important thing is that you continued caring for them even after the accident. That shows character." The rancher approached the horses, examining each one with expert eyes. He felt their legs, checked their teeth, observed their movements. After about an hour of meticulous inspection, he returned to where Thomas waited anxiously. "These are first-quality animals," declared Don Sebastian. "Wild horses from the mountains, pure blood, resistant and intelligent. You have a treasure here, boy." "Would you like to buy them, sir?" asked Thomas, remembering his family's financial difficulties. "No, lad. I have a better proposal. How about becoming my partner?" Thomas blinked, confused. "Partner, sir?" "You keep the horses, care for them, train the younger ones. When they're ready for sale, we split the profit 50-50. And I teach you everything I know about horse breeding and training. What do you think?" The proposal left Thomas speechless. It was much more than he had dared to dream. A partnership with Don Sebastian would mean not only financial security, but also the opportunity to learn from one of the greatest horse experts in the region. "But, sir," said Thomas hesitantly, "I don't have enough experience, and this leg."
"The leg will heal," interrupted Don Sebastian, "and experience is gained with time and practice. But what you've already shown, dedication, patience, and love for the animals, that can't be taught. Either you have it or you don't." After a conversation with his parents, who could hardly believe the luck that had fallen into their lives, Thomas accepted the proposal. Don Sebastian left a considerable amount of money for initial expenses and promised to return in a month to begin formal lessons. Meanwhile, news from the war continued to reach the village, and all were grim. The list of young men killed in combat grew each week, and several families in the region had already received the terrible notification that their sons would not return home. Thomas received sporadic letters from James, but they were censored by the army and contained little information about his real situation. What he could gather was that life at the front was extremely difficult, and that many of his brother's companions had already been wounded or killed. One night, while lying in his bed listening to the wind howling outside, Thomas had a revelation. He began to understand that the entire sequence of events in his life had been like a complex dance of destiny. Each step, each movement, each apparent chance had been necessary to reach the point where he was now. If Thunder hadn't been hurt that day, Don Sebastian would never have given him to Thomas. If the colt hadn't run away, he would never have returned with the herd. If Thomas hadn't tried to train the wild colt, he would never have broken his leg. And if he hadn't broken his leg, he would have been drafted for the war like his brother. And if he hadn't broken his leg, Don Sebastian would never have been impressed with his dedication to caring for the horses, even while injured.
It was as if each apparent misfortune had been, in reality, a necessary step on a staircase he couldn't see at the time, but which now revealed itself in all its complexity. When his leg finally healed enough for him to walk without crutches, although with a slight limp that would remain forever, Don Sebastian kept his promise and began teaching Thomas the secrets of horse breeding and training. The lessons took place twice a week, and each session was like a masterclass given by a true expert. Don Sebastian taught Thomas to read the signs that horses gave about their health status, their moods, their individual personalities. He taught him about equine genetics, about how to select the best breeding stock, about training techniques that respected the animal's nature without breaking their spirit. "A well-trained horse," explained Don Sebastian during one of these lessons, "is not a subjugated animal, but rather a willing partner. The difference lies in patience and respect." Thomas absorbed every word like a sponge. His injured leg had somehow sharpened his other senses, making him more observant, more patient, more attuned to the subtleties of equine behavior. He discovered that his physical disability, far from being an obstacle, had become a unique advantage in his work. The horses responded extraordinarily well to his gentle methods. Where other trainers used force and intimidation, Thomas used patience and understanding. The wildest and most undisciplined animals calmed in his presence, as if recognizing him a kind spirit that posed no threat. Months passed, and Thomas's reputation as a horse trainer began to spread throughout the region. Ranchers from distant towns came specifically to see the young man who could tame the most difficult animals without using violence. His innovative techniques, based on careful observation and non-verbal communication, revolutionized the way people in the region dealt with horses. The partnership with Don Sebastian prospered beyond all expectations. The horses trained by Thomas were sold for prices well above market average, as they had the reputation of being not only well-trained, but also emotionally balanced. Buyers came from neighboring states to acquire the animals that came from the small property in Millbrook. The family's financial situation changed completely. They built a new house, larger and more comfortable, with separate rooms for each family member. William was able to leave the heavy work of breaking stones and began helping Thomas with the horses. Martha hired a young woman from the village to help her with household chores and could finally rest her calloused hands. But perhaps the greatest transformation was in Thomas himself. The shy and dreamy boy had become a confident and respected young man. His limp, which he initially saw as a shameful deformity, became simply part of who he was, a constant reminder that sometimes the greatest blessings come disguised as curses. The news about the war finally began to improve. The conflict was coming to an end, and survivors would begin returning home soon. Thomas prayed every night that James would be among them. On a spring morning, almost 2 years after James's departure, a familiar figure appeared on the road leading to the family's house. He was thin, bronzed by the sun of distant fields, and walked with a slightly bent posture of someone who had seen things he preferred to forget. But he was unmistakably James. The reunion was emotional and filled with tears. James had survived the war, although he carried both physical and emotional scars. He had lost 2 fingers from his left hand in an explosion, and his eyes had a melancholy depth that didn't exist before his departure. When James saw the transformation that had happened in his absence, the new house, the horses, the family's prosperity, he was initially confused. "How did you manage to get all this?" he asked, observing the beautiful animals grazing in the green pasture. It was then that Thomas told the whole story: the unexpected gift from Don Sebastian, Thunder's disappearance and miraculous return with the herd, the accident that had broken his leg, and how this apparent tragedy actually saved his life and opened doors to a prosperous career. James listened to everything in silence, slowly shaking his head. When Thomas finished telling, he remained silent for a long moment, observing the younger brother who had transformed into a man. "So it was the broken leg that saved you from the war," he said finally, "and I thought you had bad luck." "I thought so too," admitted Thomas. "It took me a long time to understand that maybe good luck and bad luck don't exist the way we imagine. Maybe there's just events and what we do with them." James smiled for the first time since arriving home. "You got wise, little brother." That night, the family gathered around the dinner table, a solid wood table they never could have dreamed of owning years before. Martha had prepared a feast to celebrate James's return, and everyone was present: the parents, both sons, and even some neighbors who had been invited to the celebration. Old Theodore was also there, although visibly uncomfortable with his past pessimistic predictions. During the meal, he approached Thomas and said something that surprised everyone. "Boy," he said, clearing his throat nervously, "I owe you an apology. I said the horses would only bring trouble, and I was wrong, completely wrong." Thomas smiled gently. "You weren't wrong, Mr. Theodore. The horses really did bring trouble, but they also brought solutions. Sometimes they're the same thing." The conversation at the table naturally turned to the future. James wanted to know about the family's plans, about the horse business, about the possibilities that opened before them. Don Sebastian, who had been invited to the celebration, spoke about his plans to expand the partnership. He wanted to buy more land, increase the herd, maybe even open a formal horse training school with Thomas as the main instructor. "The boy has a gift," said Don Sebastian, raising his glass in a toast. "He can see beyond the surface of things, understand that every apparent problem might actually be a disguised opportunity." When the night came to an end and the guests said goodbye, the family was left alone on the porch of the new house, watching the stars that shone in the clear countryside sky. Thunder and the other horses grazed peacefully in the pasture, their silhouettes outlined against the silver moonlight. "You know," said Martha, breaking the contemplative silence, "when it all started with that injured colt, I thought it was just another mouth to feed. I never imagined it could lead to all this." "Sometimes," replied Thomas, absently petting Thunder, who had approached the fence, "the greatest adventures begin with the smallest acts of kindness." William, who continued being a man of few words, just nodded wisely. He had learned that sometimes silence is the best way to express depth of feeling.
James, still adapting to his family's new reality, asked a question that everyone was thinking but no one had verbalized. "And now, where do we go from here?" Thomas looked toward the horizon, where the mountains were silhouetted against the starry sky. he thought about all the twists and turns his life had taken, about all the apparent curses that had revealed themselves as blessings, about all the lessons he had learned about the unpredictable nature of destiny. Now, he finally said, we continue doing what we've always done. We take care of the horses, we take care of each other, and we stay open to whatever life wants to bring us. Because I've learned that we never know if what seems like good luck is really good luck, and if what seems like bad luck is really bad luck. Everything depends on perspective and time. Mrs. Grace, who had joined them on the porch, smiled with her wisdom of years lived. The boy has learned one of life's most important lessons, she said, that we don't control destiny, but we can choose how to react to what it brings us. And so, under the starry sky of Millbrook, surrounded by the horses that had transformed their lives in ways they never could have imagined, the family reflected on the strange dance between fortune and misfortune, between blessing and curse, between what seems to be and what really is. Thunder whinnied softly, as if wanting to participate in the conversation, and everyone laughed. The animal that had arrived as an unexpected burden had become the catalyst for a complete transformation in their lives. He had taught them all a fundamental lesson that sometimes the greatest gifts come wrapped in the most unlikely paper. Years later, when Thomas was already a mature and respected horse breeder, when his training school had become famous throughout the country, when Don Sebastian had retired and left the entire business in his capable hands, he still remembered that morning when a limping colt had changed the course of his life forever. He told this story to his own children and to the young people who came to learn from him the art of working with horses. He always ended the same way. Remember, life isn't made of good luck or bad luck. It's made of moments, and what we do with them is what determines who we become. And when the children asked if he considered that he had good luck or bad luck on that distant day, Thomas would smile and answer, "I had life, and life is always a mixture of both. The secret is knowing that sometimes they're the same thing, just seen from different angles." Thunder lived many years, always as the respected leader of the herd, always as Thomas's most faithful companion. When his time finally came to depart on a quiet autumn morning, he died peacefully in the pasture where he had spent the best years of his life, surrounded by the other horses and by the man who had learned from him the most important lessons about destiny, patience, and the mysterious beauty of life. And even after Thunder departed, his lesson remained, that sometimes the greatest gifts arrive in disguise, that the greatest blessings can seem like curses, and that true wisdom lies in understanding that good luck and bad luck are frequently two faces of the same coin, spinning eternally in the air, waiting to see which side they'll land on. The story of the boy and the horse became legend in Millbrook and neighboring towns, told and retold through generations, always with the same fundamental question: was it good luck or bad luck? And always with the same wise answer: maybe it was simply life. But the true depth of this lesson would only reveal itself completely years later, when a new generation would face their own challenges and discover that Thomas's words carried wisdom that transcended time. 10 years after the war's end, when Thomas had already established himself as the most respected horse breeder in the region, an unexpected event would test once more his understanding of destiny's mysteries. It was a sultry summer afternoon when an unknown young man arrived at the village, mounted on a magnificent horse but visibly exhausted. A lad couldn't be more than 20 years old, had blonde hair disheveled by the wind of the road, and blue eyes that reflected iron determination mixed with desperation. His clothes, though of good quality, were covered with dust and showed signs of a long and difficult journey. When he dismounted in front of Thomas's property, his legs trembled slightly, revealing extreme fatigue. "I'm looking for Thomas Wilson," said the young man, his voice hoarse from thirst and exhaustion. "They told me in town that he's the best horse trainer in the entire region." Thomas, who was in the pasture checking a pregnant mare, approached with his characteristic discreet limp. At 26 years old, he had become a man of striking presence. Not because of height or physical strength, but because of the calm authority that emanated from his gestures and the premature wisdom that shone in his honey-colored eyes. "I'm Thomas," he said, extending his hand, "and from the state of your horse, I'd say you two have had quite a difficult journey." The young man shook the offered hand with visible gratitude. "My name is Robert Pemberton. I've come from very far away, from the state capitol. I need your help." Robert's horse was truly magnificent, a purebred Arabian with brilliant black coat with elegant lines that revealed its noble lineage. But the animal was clearly suffering, not just from the journey's fatigue, but from something deeper that Thomas soon identified with his experienced eyes. "This horse is sick," observed Thomas, carefully approaching the animal. "And the illness hasn't been going on for long. What happened?" Robert lowered his head, and for a moment it seemed he would collapse right there. "It's a long story," he murmured, "and I don't know if you'll believe it." "Young man," said Thomas gently, "I've learned that the most impossible stories are often the truest ones. Why don't you tell everything from the beginning?" And so, sitting on the house's porch while Martha prepared fresh water and food for the exhausted visitor, Robert began to tell his story. He was the son of a wealthy merchant from the capital, heir to a considerable fortune and destined to take over the family business. His life had been planned down to the smallest details since birth. The best schools, university in Europe, and arranged marriage with another important merchant's daughter. "I never questioned any of it," explained Robert, gratefully accepting the glass of cold water that Martha offered him. "It was what was expected of me, and I simply followed the script they had written for my life." But everything changed when Robert turned 18 and received as a birthday gift the Arabian horse that he had brought with him. The animal, called Shadow, had been specially imported for him, costing a fortune that represented several years' wages for a common family. "From the first moment I saw him," continued Robert, his eyes gaining a special gleam, "I knew there was something different about him. It wasn't just his beauty or his lineage. It was as if he could see inside my soul and understand things about me that I didn't understand myself." Thomas nodded, understanding perfectly. He had experienced the same sensation with thunder years before.
But Robert's family didn't look favorably on this growing passion for horses. They wanted him to concentrate on business, to gradually assume the responsibilities that would come with the inheritance. The rides were initially tolerated as a young man's pastime, but when they began interfering with studies and social commitments, pressure for him to stop increased. "The last straw," said Robert, his voice becoming tenser, "was when I refused the arranged marriage they had planned for me. I said I didn't love the girl, that I wanted to choose my own path in life. My father was furious." The argument that followed was epic. Shouting, accusations, ultimatums. Robert's father, a man accustomed to having his will obeyed without question, declared that if his son didn't follow the established plan for his life, he would be completely disinherited. "I could have given in," admitted Robert. "Should have given in, perhaps. It was the sensible thing to do. But at that moment, something inside me rebelled. For the first time in my life, I said no." The response was immediate and brutal. Robert was expelled from home the same day, with only the clothes on his back and the horse he had received as a gift. All his possessions, his inheritance, his social position, everything was cut in a single blow. "Suddenly," he said, looking at his own hands, "I was nobody. A rich young man who had become a wanderer, without hearth or home, overnight." But Robert didn't regret his decision. On the contrary, for the first time in his life, he felt he was being true to himself. He and Shadow left the capital without a certain destination, living off the occasional sale of small valuable objects he had managed to take with him. "They were the most difficult months of my life," he continued, "but also the most genuine. I learned what it means to work for each meal, sleep in the open when I didn't have money for an inn, depend only on myself to survive." During this journey, Robert discovered he had a natural talent for working with horses. He found temporary employment at various ranches along the way, always impressing the owners with his ability to handle difficult animals. But he always moved on, seeking something he himself didn't quite know what it was. "Until 3 weeks ago," said Robert, his voice becoming somber, "Shadow began to get sick. The animal had developed a strange condition that the veterinarians Robert managed to consult couldn't diagnose. Shadow was losing weight rapidly, refused to eat properly, and his strength visibly diminished each day. There was something in Shadow's eyes, a deep sadness that seemed to go beyond physical illness. "That's when someone told me about you," said Robert, looking directly at Thomas. "They said you have a special gift, that you can cure horses that others considered lost, that you understand things about them that go beyond common medicine." Thomas got up and walked to where Shadow was grazing, observing the animal attentively. What he saw worried him. Not just the physical symptoms Robert had described, but something more subtle in the horse's posture, in his movements, in the way he kept his head low. "This horse isn't just physically sick," said Thomas finally. "He's heartbroken." Robert looked at him with incomprehension. "How so?" "Horses are extremely sensitive animals to human emotions. They absorb our feelings, our anxieties, our sadnesses. Shadow feels your pain, your uncertainty about the future, your fears about having made the right decision, and this is literally making him sick." It was an explanation that challenged conventional medical logic, but made perfect sense to someone who had spent years studying the deep connection between horses and their caretakers. Thomas had seen similar cases before, animals that developed physical symptoms in response to their owner's emotional suffering. "But how can I cure something I don't even know how to resolve myself?" asked Robert, desperation evident in his voice. "First," said Thomas, "we'll take care of the physical symptoms. I have some natural remedies that can help. But the real cure will only happen when you find peace with yourself." In the days that followed, Robert stayed as a guest at Thomas's property, helping with horse care in exchange for food and shelter. It was work he knew well, and he quickly integrated into the farm's routine. But more important than the physical work were the long conversations he maintained with Thomas during the afternoons. "You're afraid," observed Thomas in one of these conversations while they watched the sunset from a nearby hilltop. "Afraid of having made the wrong choice, afraid of not being able to build a life on your own, afraid that your family was right about you being an impractical dreamer." Robert didn't deny it. "What if I really made a terrible mistake? What if I threw away a safe and comfortable life for a romantic fantasy that leads nowhere?" "What if you didn't throw anything away, but found something much more valuable?" countered Thomas. "What if you call that mistake was actually the first truly yours own decision you made in your entire life?" Then Thomas told Robert his own story. The injured colt, the herd that came and went, the accident that broke his leg, how each event that seemed like a tragedy had revealed itself as a disguised blessing. Robert listened to everything in silence, absorbing every word. "Are you telling me I should see my situation as good luck instead of bad luck?" asked Robert when Thomas finished. "I'm saying maybe you should stop trying to categorize your life as good luck or bad luck and start seeing it simply as your life, unique, imperfect, but genuinely yours." This conversation marked a turning point for Robert. He began to realize that his obsession with judging his decisions as right or wrong was preventing him from simply living the consequences of them. He was so worried about knowing if he had made the right choice that he couldn't dedicate himself to making that choice work. Shadow also began to improve, as if he could sense a change in his owner's attitude. The animal returned to eating normally, recovered the shine in his eyes, moved again with the grace that was his trademark. It was as if Robert's emotional healing had unlocked the animal's physical recovery capacity. One morning, 2 weeks after his arrival, Robert woke up with a different feeling in his chest. For the first time in months, he felt at peace with his decisions. Not because he was sure they were right, but because he had accepted that they were his. And that, he discovered, made all the difference. "I think it's time to move on," he said to Thomas that morning. "But I don't know how to thank you for everything you have done for me and Shadow." "There's a way," replied Thomas with a smile. "Tell your story. Not to convince anyone to follow your path, but to remind people that they have the right to choose their own." Robert left the next morning, but not before promising to keep in touch. He had decided to continue traveling, offering his services as a horse trainer wherever needed. It wouldn't be an easy or predictable life, but it would be his. Thomas watched him leave, with Shadow trotting vigorously alongside other young horses that had approached to say goodbye. It was a scene that vaguely reminded him of the day Thunder had left and returned with his herd years before. "Another story of good luck or bad luck?" asked Martha, who had joined her son to watch the departure. "Another story about choices," replied Thomas, "and about having the courage to live with their consequences." But the encounter with Robert had planted a seed in Thomas's mind. He began to reflect on his own journey and on how many other people could benefit from the lessons he had learned, not just about horses, but about life, destiny, and the courage to accept both the blessings and difficulties that fate presents us. That's how the idea of writing a book was born. Not a technical manual about horse breeding, but a collection of stories. His own story, Robert's, and those of so many others he had met over the years. People who had faced moments of choice between what seemed safe and what seemed true. Thomas wasn't an experienced writer, but he had something more valuable: authentic stories and the distilled wisdom of years of experience. He began writing at night, by lamplight, after finishing the daily work with the horses. The book grew slowly, one page at a time, one story at a time. Thomas wrote about Don Sebastian and his unexpected generosity, about the limp that saved him from war, about Robert and Shadow, about all the horses and people who had passed through his life, leaving precious lessons. But more than any individual story, the book spoke about accepting uncertainty as a fundamental part of the human condition, about how wisdom isn't in knowing if something is good luck or bad luck, but in being present for the experience, whatever it may be. When the book was finished, 2 years later, Thomas had a surprise. Robert returned to visit him, this time accompanied by a young woman he introduced as his wife. They had met at a ranch where Robert had worked temporarily, and she had fallen in love with both him and his philosophy of authentic living. "You were right," said Robert, observing the horses in the pasture. "It wasn't about making the right or wrong choice. It was about making my choice, and then making it right through the way I would live it." Robert had prospered in his new life. His talents as a horse trainer had become legendary in several regions, and he now had a loyal clientele that sought him out specifically. More importantly, he had found a companion who shared his values and dreams. "And Shadow?" asked Thomas, noticing that the magnificent Arabian horse wasn't with them. "Shadow is very well," smiled Robert. "Actually, he's waiting for you." Outside, tied to the fence, was not only Shadow, but also an equally magnificent Arabian mare and a small colt that was clearly their offspring. "Shadow became a father," explained Robert, "and I'd like you to keep the colt, as a form of gratitude, and also because I think he needs to learn from the best." Thomas was deeply touched by the gesture. The colt was a magnificent creature, with his father's elegance and a vivacity that promised great personality. But more than that, the gift represented a continuation of the chain of generosity that had begun with Don Sebastian years before. "Does he have a name?" asked Thomas, stroking the colt's silky neck. "Hope," said Robert, "because that's what you gave back to me when I needed it most." And so, once again, a horse arrived in Thomas's life, bringing with it new possibilities and new challenges. Hope grew quickly, revealing not only physical beauty, but also extraordinary intelligence and a special connection with Thomas that was very reminiscent of the relationship he had had with Thunder. Thomas's book also found its own way in the world. Initially published modestly by a local publisher, the stories began to circulate and gain admirers. People from different walks of life wrote to tell how the book's reflections had helped in their own journeys of self-discovery. One day, a special letter reached Thomas's hands. It was from a young soldier who had read the book during a difficult period of military service. He wrote about how the story of the broken leg that saved him from war had helped him process his own feelings about serving in peacetime. "Your story helped me understand that I don't need to know if my situation is good or bad. I just need to know that it's my situation and do the best I can with it." Letters like this arrived regularly, each telling a different story about how the book's lessons had been applied to specific circumstances. Thomas kept them all, not out of vanity, but because they represented an extension of the chain of understanding and wisdom that had begun with his own experience. As the years passed, Thomas's property became a place of informal pilgrimage for people seeking not just to train horses, but to find a different perspective on life's challenges. Young people in career transitions, people facing personal crises, individuals simply seeking a deeper meaning for their experiences. Thomas never proclaimed himself a guru or counselor. He continued being fundamentally a horse breeder and trainer. But there was something in his calm presence, in his serene acceptance of life's complexities, that offered comfort and clarity to those who sought him out. One of the most memorable visitors was a woman named Helen, who arrived on a rainy winter afternoon carrying a small suitcase and a devastating story of loss. She had lost her husband in a work accident 6 months before, and since then had struggled to find a reason to continue living. "Everyone tells me I should look on the bright side of things," she told Thomas during one of their long conversations on the porch, "that I should find a way to transform this tragedy into something positive, but I can't. Sometimes a bad thing is just bad." Thomas nodded understandingly. "And sometimes," he said, "wisdom lies in accepting that truth. Not everything needs to have a positive side to have meaning." It was a different perspective from what Helen had heard from other well-intentioned counselors, and she felt relieved to finally have permission to simply feel her pain without trying to transform it into something uplifting. "So what do I do with this pain?" she asked Thomas. "Carry it," he replied simply, "not because it's good or bad, but because it's yours, and because carrying it with dignity is a way of honoring what you've lost." Helen stayed at the property for 3 months, helping with the horses and participating in the daily reflections that had become an informal tradition of the place. When she left, she wasn't cured in the conventional sense. She still missed her husband, still carried the pain of loss, but she had found a way to carry that pain that didn't destroy her. "You taught me that I don't need to be strong all the time," she said in farewell. "Sometimes I can just be human."
Stories like Helen's repeated regularly, each unique in its details, but universal in its themes. People arrived carrying their own versions of the question about good luck versus bad luck, and left with a more nuanced understanding about the complex nature of human experience. And through it all, hope grew and became Thomas's closest companion, just as Thunder had been years before.
The horse proved to be not only intelligent and beautiful, but also gifted with a special sensitivity to human emotions that made him a perfect partner in the work of helping troubled visitors. As Thomas aged, he was now in his 40s, his wisdom deepened, but also simplified. The great questions about destiny and free will that had occupied his thoughts for years reduced to simpler truths about presence, acceptance, and the courage to live authentically. One evening, as he sat on his porch watching Hope and the other horses graze in the golden light of sunset, Thomas reflected on the long journey that had brought him to this moment. From a poor boy dreaming of adventures to a respected man whose wisdom was sought by people from far and wide, the path had been neither straight nor predictable. But perhaps that was the point. Life, he had learned, wasn't meant to be a straight line from point A to point B. It was meant to be a dance, sometimes graceful, sometimes clumsy, but always moving to a rhythm that could only be understood in retrospect. The question that had haunted his childhood, was it good luck or bad luck, no longer seemed relevant. What mattered wasn't the label he placed on events, but how he chose to respond to them. Every apparent setback contained the seeds of unexpected growth. Every blessing had come with its own challenges. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Thomas felt a deep sense of gratitude wash over him. Not for the wealth or success he had achieved, but for the journey itself, all of it, the painful parts as much as the joyful ones. Each experience had taught him something valuable about resilience, compassion, and the mysterious ways that life weaves meaning from seeming chaos. Hope approached the fence and nuzzled his hand, as if sensing his reflective mood. Thomas smiled and stroked the horse's nose, remembering Thunder and all the other animals who had been his teachers over the years. "What do you think, old friend?" he murmured to Hope. "Was it all good luck or bad luck?" Hope just snorted softly and returned to grazing, as if to say that such questions were beyond the concern of horses, who lived fully in each moment without the burden of categorizing their experiences. And perhaps, Thomas thought, that was the wisest approach of all. The story of Thomas and his horses continued to spread, passed down through generations like a folk tale that contained timeless truths about the human condition. Children grew up hearing about the boy who received a gift that seemed like a blessing, lost it in what appeared to be a curse, only to discover that both were necessary steps in a larger pattern that could only be seen from a distance. Some listeners took from the story a message about patience, that we must wait to see how events unfold before judging them. Others heard a call to acceptance, that we must embrace uncertainty as an inescapable part of existence. Still others found encouragement to trust in a larger wisdom that operates beyond our limited understanding. But perhaps the deepest truth the story offered was simpler than any of these interpretations. Perhaps it was simply this, that life is neither good luck nor bad luck, but rather an ongoing conversation between what we expect and what actually happens, between what we plan and what we discover, between who we think we are and who we become through the living of our days. And in that conversation, Thomas had learned that the most important voice wasn't the one that judged or categorized or tried to control the narrative. It was the one that remained present, curious, and open to whatever wisdom each moment might contain. As he aged and eventually passed on, Thomas's legacy lived not in the wealth he had accumulated or the horses he had trained, but in the countless people whose lives had been touched by his simple message that every ending contains a beginning, every loss holds the possibility of unexpected gain, and every apparent misfortune might be fortune in disguise. The horses continued to graze in the fields around Millbrook, their presence a living reminder that sometimes the greatest gifts come not from what we plan or control, but from what we receive with open hands and grateful hearts, trusting that even when we cannot see the pattern, there is one being woven through all our days. And somewhere in that pattern, the spirit of thunder and all the horses that followed him continue to run free, carrying with them the eternal truth that good luck and bad luck are often the same event, viewed from different moments in time, and that wisdom lies not in solving this paradox, but in dancing with it, one step at a time, until the music stops, and we discover what the dance was really about. Do you enjoy chilling stories, mysterious legends, and tales that make you think twice before turning off the lights? Then you're in the right place. On this channel, every video is a journey into the unknown, bringing you spooky tales, curiosities, and mysteries you won't find just anywhere. So hit that subscribe button, drop a like, and share this video with someone who also loves a good dark story. That way you'll help our community grow and make sure you don't miss the next tale.